Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Chad, and this is the third video in the series on JavaScript array methods you need to know as a software engineer. In this video, we'll talk about the findIndex, find, and indexOf methods and learn how to use them with some examples. Let's get into it. First up is the findIndex method, which accepts a function that takes three arguments: the current array item, the index of the current item, and the array itself. This method returns the index of the first element for which the provided function returns true. And note that the findIndex method short circuits, very similar to other array methods I've talked about in other videos, like the every and some methods. So going back to our cartoon characters array we've used before, let's say we want to find the index of Reggie. So we'll have a const here, we'll set that equal to index, and we'll use the findIndex method, and we'll pass that a function. And this first argument here will be the character for each iteration. And we just want to return a Boolean value here, and what we're looking for is a character with the first name equal to Reggie. So if we console log that out, then over here in the console we'll see 3, which you'll notice is indeed the index of Reggie in the array. 0, 1, 2, and 3. Cool. Now what if the item doesn't exist in the array? Well, let's try to find Goofy. And if we save that, now we see -1. So we get -1 if the index is not found. Alright. Well, sometimes your use case might require that you get the index of an item, in which case findIndex works perfectly. But it can also be used simply to see if an item exists in the array at all. And let's add a small helper function here. Call it isInArray. And it will take a name. And we'll just grab this and paste it in here, and instead of looking for a name explicitly, we'll just check against the name that we pass into this function here. Now recall that if the result of findIndex is -1, it means the item was not found in the array. So if it's greater than 1, it means the item was in the array. So we'll just return whether or not the index is greater than 1. And now we can add some checks here. So I'll get rid of that. And we'll try to find SpongeBob. And then maybe we'll try to find Goofy again. Goffy. And then we'll add another log statement at the end here just to know when we're done. Now when we save this, we see found SpongeBob and completed search, but we didn't see any logging about Goofy. So comparing the index returned from findIndex to -1 here, which indicates the item wasn't found, can give us a nice Boolean to work with. And real quick, I wanted to show the usage of the second and third arguments to the findIndex callback function, which, as I mentioned, are the current iteration's index and the array on which we're operating. Now, I mentioned this a couple times in some other videos, but I typically don't use these arguments. However, I do still think it's important to know that they're there for use. So let's say we want to find the index of the first character that shares a last name with a character in an adjacent position in the array. That's kind of a mouthful, but essentially what we're looking for is 2 duplicate last names that are next to each other. So we're looking for these 2 here. So we'll get rid of this and call that index of adjacent duplicate, and we'll find index and pass in the character index and the array itself. And for the first iteration, we're just going to return false here, because the first item can't be a duplicate of any other since we haven't checked anything else yet. On the rest of the iterations, we'll return whether or not the current character's last name is equal to the previous character's last name. And we can do that by checking the current character's last name to the previous item using the current index -1, and we'll check that one's last name. Now coming down here, if the resulting index is greater than -1, then we know that we found a character with a duplicate last name. And we can console log out here. And using that index that we found, and if we save that, we see first with duplicate last name is Angelica Pickles, because she shares the same last name as Tommy, and they are next to each other in the array. So it's a bit of a contrived example, but that does show how you might use the index and array arguments. But if you've found a real-world use case for those two arguments, please do let me know down in the comments. I'd really like to hear it. Next up is the indexOf method, which is identical to findIndex in terms of the end goal, in that both are used to get the index of a particular element in the array, but they differ in their approach. If you watched my previous video on the every, sum, and includes methods, or if you're already familiar with the includes method, you'll recall that it takes a search element instead of a callback function. IndexOf is like that as well. Let's take a look. So we'll get rid of this here, and we'll just have an index variable, and we'll set that equal to characters.indexOf, and first name Mickey, last name Mouse, and age 93. And if we console this out, notice here how index is -1 in the console, indicating that the element wasn't found. But wait a minute, Mickey is in the array, so shouldn't we find an index? Well, as I mentioned in the other video, indexOf is checking the reference, and in this case, the reference, this here, isn't strictly equal to that of the element that we're trying to find in the array. It's the same problem with includes. So one more look back at how we can get around this with a trick of the map method. So if we take our characters array here and we map it, in other words, we're going to transform it into a new array, and we'll grab the first name out of that. That's using object destructuring, and we'll just return first name, and let's go ahead and console log that out. We'll just keep that index for now. And if we save that, now we see that we get just an array of first names. Cool, halfway there. All right, so now we can do indexOf and pass a string. Perfect, so now we get a result of 5. And this is another example of how these array methods often work together nicely by chaining them to achieve something with relatively little and readable code. That said though, generally speaking, I would recommend using findIndex and indexOf in these situations. If you're dealing with an array of objects, use findIndex. If you're dealing with an array of primitives like numbers, booleans, strings, then use indexOf. The last method we'll talk about in this video is the find method, which can be used to, well, find an element in an array. It uses an identical syntax as findIndex in terms of accepting a function as an argument, but in this case returns the element if it's found rather than the index. So let's take a look how we can use that. So we'll just have a character variable, and using our characters array, If we call find on it, and this function, like findIndex, also takes 3 arguments, the current character on this iteration, the index, and the array as the second and third arguments. We won't use those in this example since I've already shown it once, but moving forward, so now let's say we want to find a character whose first name is equal to Mickey, and we'll console log that out. Saving that, we find this object here, and that is Mickey. So Mickey was found from the array using the find method. Now if we change the name we're looking for, we can see how it behaves when the item isn't found. Let's say we want to find Sandy. And if we save that, now we see the result is undefined. So if your use case is simply to check if an item exists in the array, and you have an array of objects like we do here, find is a great option that I generally favor over the includes, findIndex, and indexOf methods. Now one last quick example, similar to what we saw with findIndex. Let's say we just create a helper function, we'll call it isInArray like we did before, and again this is going to take in a name, and what we'll return here is this result here. We'll just copy that down here, and instead of using an explicit name, we'll just compare the character's first name to the passed in name. Now if you're not familiar with this syntax here, some might call that a double bang or a double exclamation point. It converts the value to the right of it to a Boolean. So if the character is found, the result of find will be the character object, like we saw in the console with Mickey. And with the double exclamation point, that character object, which is considered truthy, will be converted to the Boolean true value. Now if we come down here, we can call our helper method, and let's say we're looking for Tommy. And if we get in here, we can say we found Tommy. And in this case, let's say we're looking for Rocco. And we'll say if we found Rocco if we get in here. And then at the very end, we can say, like we did before, completed search, just to know that we're at the end. Now if we save this, we see found Tommy and then completed search. We never saw any logging about Rocco because he wasn't in the array. Alright folks, that's all I have on the findIndex, indexOf, and findArray methods for this video. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please consider hitting that like button. Also, if you're interested in more content like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel as I have a few more array method videos lined up for this series. And please consider leaving a comment down below if you have a request for a certain type of content. As always, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.